A few months ago, I was looking at 2 job offers. On paper, it wasn't being a contest. Offer A had a better title, 20% more pay, and a clear path for promotion. All the data, every spreadsheet I made pointed right at it. It was a rational choice. But every time I went to accept it, I felt this pit in my stomach, a genuine physical dread. Offer B was less certain, a bit of a risk, but thinking about it felt calm. My friends thought I was crazy for even hesitating. They said I was letting irrational feelings cloud my judgment, but that's what stuck with me. Was it really irrational? Or was that feeling just a different kind of data? Was it a survival mechanism? An evaluation based on things my spreadsheet couldn't track? This is the problem at the absolute center of understanding what we are. Are our emotions just noise? Or are they the most intelligent part of us? Okay, let's unpack this. For centuries, really, the ideal human has been seen as the purely rational actor, the person who suppresses feeling to make clear, logical choices.
All right, the Spock ideal, almost.
Exactly. But today, we are diving deep into research that fundamentally challenges that whole idea, that old belief that emotion and reason are somehow enemies.
That they're antagonistic.
Yeah. We're moving beyond just dismissing irrational feelings as noise. And we're asking, what if that gut feeling is actually, well, what if it's a high-speed, complex data summary delivered right to your consciousness?
It's a fantastic question. And what we're seeing is this really fascinating convergence. You've got neurobiology, psychology, and crucially, economics all coming together. It's a field we now call neuroeconomics.
Neuroeconomics, okay.
And this whole interdisciplinary approach suggests something radical. Emotions aren't a glitch. They're not a bug in the system. They seem to be an integral, maybe even a highly efficient component of what we call rational decision-making.
Wow. Okay, so how do we get our heads around that? Feels like a huge shift.
It is. And to really understand this paradigm shift, we kind of need to trace the connection. We can start with something really basic, something measurable, the human heart.
The actual heartbeat.
The heartbeat itself. And follow that signal right into the deep circuits of the brain. And then we need to see how culture grabs those raw biological feelings and completely changes how we perceive them, how we use them.
Okay, that makes sense. So where do we start? You mentioned economics. Let's maybe start where the stakes feel highest and where that idea of cold calculating reason is, well, traditionally worshipped.
The financial markets. Perfect example.
Right. We picture a professional trader just glued to screens, pure numbers, probability, speed, cold logic.
That's the stereotype.
Yeah.
But recent research, particularly some really interesting work coming out of London, tells a completely different story about what actually makes a trader successful. It's not just about the math. So this study focused on professional financial traders. These are people managing huge sums of money, making split-second decisions on the trading floor.
High pressure.
Extremely high pressure. And the researchers didn't primarily measure their math skills or how well they knew economic theory. They measured something called interoceptive ability.
Interoceptive ability. Okay, break that down for us. That's about sensing your own body, right?
Precisely. It's your ability to accurately sense the physiological state of your own body from the inside.
So not just knowing you have a heartbeat, but actually being able to track its rhythm, feel the changes without putting your fingers on your wrist.
Exactly that. It's an internal awareness of your visceral states, your heart, your gut, maybe even your breathing. And the core finding was, well, pretty striking. These professional traders, as a group, were significantly better at detecting their own heartbeat compared to control groups of non-traders.
Really? Just inherently better at it?
It seems so. They were, you could say, quite literally more in tune with their own internal physiology.
Okay, so they're better at sensing their heart's rhythm. That's interesting in itself. But did it matter? Did it actually make them better traders? Did it connect to their performance?
That's the crucial link. It absolutely did. This superior interoceptive ability wasn't just a curious trait. It correlated positively and significantly with their real-world success.
How did they measure success?
2 key ways. First, their actual profit and loss performance over the period they were studied. Better interoception meant better P&L.
Wow.
And second, their job tenure. How long they actually survived and thrived in that incredibly demanding high-turnover environment. Better interoception meant they lasted longer.
Okay, that directly challenges that whole purely rational agent model in economics, doesn't it? Where emotion or even awareness of the body is just seen as noise, a liability.
Fundamentally.
Yeah.
It suggests that sensitivity to internal physiological signals is somehow advantageous in making complex, rapid decisions under uncertainty.
But why? That's the big question. Why would feeling your heart rate more accurately help you sell futures or avoid a market crash? Is it just about speed?
Yeah.
Like the body's signal gets there faster than crunching numbers?
Speed is definitely part of it. Think about the trading environment. It's defined by massive amounts of information, high volatility meaning risk is always changing, high cognitive load, and very, very little time to make decisions that can have huge consequences.
Analysis paralysis is a real danger.
Exactly. A slower, purely cognitive assessment might mean you react too late or you just freeze. Interoception, this body awareness, seems to act as a kind of rapid, almost preconscious filter.
A filter, how so?
Well, imagine a trader can, maybe subconsciously at first, sense that subtle physiological spike, a slight quickening of the heart, maybe a change in skin conductivity, feeling that accompanies a sudden, unexpected downturn in the market.
Okay.
That internal signal acts as a powerful, instantaneous warning. It might allow them to pull out of a bad trade or resist chasing a rising price that feels wrong, maybe moments before their conscious brain can fully process why it's the right move.
It's like an early warning system.
A very efficient one. It's a mechanism for swift risk aversion or maybe even spotting opportunity, honed by the body's reaction to uncertainty. It's potentially much faster than waiting for the rational calculation to complete.
Okay, so the heart, or maybe the body more generally, is generating this potentially valuable risk data. But that raw signal needs to be interpreted, right? There must be somewhere in the brain that takes that faster heartbeat and says, hey, pay attention, risk. Where does that happen?
That brings us squarely to a really key brain region, the anterior insula. You'll often see it abbreviated as AI, but let's stick with anterior insula to avoid confusion with artificial intelligence.
Good point. Anterior insula. Got it.
You can think of the anterior insula as the brain's primary translator, or maybe like an internal dashboard for your bodily state. In neurobiology, when we first talk about emotions, we often mean the raw, involuntary bodily reactions, the physiological changes, heartbeat changes, skin conductance, blood pressure shifts that knot in your stomach.
The physical stuff.
Exactly. The anterior insula's central job seems to be taking all these raw biological inputs and synthesizing them. It translates these streams of physiological data into coherent, conscious feelings. It's what allows us to become self-aware of our current emotional state.
Ah, okay. So the anterior insula is why a faster heart rate isn't just a faster heart rate. We experience it as, say, fear or maybe excitement. It turns the physical reality into the subjective feeling.
Precisely. It's a critical integration hub. It's pulling together sensory inputs, what you're seeing, hearing, touching with autonomous inputs, what your nervous system is doing automatically, like heart rate plus affective inputs, that raw emotional quality, and even cognitive inputs, what you're currently thinking about.
It's connecting everything.
Right. And that's why the anterior insula lights up during reactions to things like physical pain or feelings of disgust, strong visceral reactions, but it's also active during more complex social emotions like empathy.
Empathy, how does that fit?
Well, when you empathize, your brain is, in a sense, running a simulation of what another person might be feeling, and that often involves activating brain areas associated with your own feeling states, including the anterior insula. It helps you understand by mirroring their potential internal state.
And this connects back to those successful traders and their heartbeat detection. Was there a direct brain link found?
Absolutely. The research really tied it together anatomically. Other studies, not just the trader one, have shown that the actual physical size, the gray matter volume or density of an individual's anterior insula correlates directly with how accurate they are at detecting their own heartbeat.
So a bigger or denser anterior insula means better heartbeat detection.
Generally, yes. It suggests a stronger physical connection or perhaps more efficient processing pathway between the heart signals and this key brain region. Better interoceptive connectivity means the individual is potentially more tuned in to these subtle but important shifts in their internal state, which, as the trader study suggests, might reflect environmental changes, especially around risk and reward.
So the structure of your brain in this specific area relates to how well your mind and body are communicating about these feelings.
Exactly. It provides a structural basis for why some people might be better at using these gut feelings effectively.
Okay, let's drill down even more specifically into risk. How is the brain, maybe the anterior insula, actually tracking risk itself? Because financial risk, like you said, is volatile. It's not just a simple 50-50 coin flip. Markets are messy, unpredictable.
That unpredictable nature is exactly what makes it so interesting from a neurobiological standpoint. Financial risk has this statistical property called leptokurtosis.
Let's go kurtosis. Okay, that sounds technical. Can you give us the simple version? What does that mean for risk?
Sure. Simply put, it means fat tails. If you think about a normal distribution, like a standard bell curve.
Right. Most results cluster around the average.
Yeah. And extreme results, way out in the tails of the curve, are supposed to be very, very rare. But financial markets don't really behave like that. Leptokurtosis means that those large, surprising price swings, the big jumps or crashes, the outliers happen much more frequently than a normal bell curve would predict. The tails are fatter.
So extreme events are more common than we might naively expect.
Exactly. And it means the level of risk, the volatility, isn't constant. It's always changing, often in surprising ways. Risk clusters. You get periods of calm, then periods of high turmoil.
And economists have mathematical models to try and capture this changing volatility, right? You mentioned one earlier, JRCH.
That's right. GRCH, it stands for Generalized Autoregressive Conditional Heteroscedasticity, but you don't need to remember that.
Why not?
It's basically a popular statistical tool economists use to model how volatility changes over time. It tries to predict tomorrow's risk based on today's risk and yesterday's surprises.
Okay, now here's where it gets really wild for me. You said the anterior insula, this brain area we link to feelings, disgust, self-awareness, was found to be tracking a purely mathematical quantity from these GRCH models. How on earth did they show that?
This was a really key discovery because it provided pretty definitive proof that, affect or feeling and cognition or thinking are deeply intertwined. They're not separate modules. Researchers designed experiments, often involving gambling tasks or simulated markets, where they could calculate the GRCH model's prediction of risk second by second. And they found that the level of activation in the anterior insula correlated directly with something economists call the risk prediction error.
Risk prediction error. What's that exactly?
In simple terms, the GRCH model uses a mathematical driving term, basically, how surprising today's market movement was to predict the next period's risk. The risk prediction error is essentially the difference between the risk a market actually delivered, the realized volatility, and the level of risk the GRCH model expected to see based on recent history. It's a measure of surprise about risk itself.
Okay, wait, so the anterior insula isn't just reacting to, say, losing money. It's tracking how surprising the level of risk was compared to a sophisticated mathematical model's expectation.
That's precisely the finding. It's processing the mathematical surprise term that drives the GRCH process. The fact that this brain structure, previously thought of mainly in terms of visceral feelings, is tracking this abstract, rational, mathematical signal. Well, it blew the doors off the idea that emotion and calculation are separate.
It suggests the emotional system is actively involved in sophisticated prediction, constantly running its own high-speed model of expected versus actual risk.
That seems to be the implication. It's assessing the environment not just for immediate outcomes, but for changes in the underlying probability of future outcomes.
That's incredible. But the anterior insula isn't working alone, is it? You also mentioned the brain's general attention and arousal system gets involved when risk changes the Neuroeconomics system.
Yes, exactly. Primarily driven by a small brainstem nucleus called the locus coeruleus, or LC.
Locus coeruleus, okay.
The LC is like the brain's master attention switch, or maybe an amplifier. It's a compact cluster of neurons that use the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. When the LC becomes highly active, it floods key areas of the brain with norepinephrine. This increases your overall arousal, your alertness, your vigilance, your focused attention. It's basically telling the entire system, wake up. Something important is happening. Pay attention.
And we can actually track this. How?
One really neat way is by looking at pupil dilation. Your pupil size changes constantly, mainly due to light. But even when you control for light levels, your pupils get slightly larger when you're more mentally aroused or engaged, or when you encounter something surprising or effortful. And it turns out that these subtle changes in pupil size are a pretty good non-invasive proxy for activity in the locus coeruleus.
So bigger pupils can mean the LC is more active.
Generally, yes. And studies, some using clever auditory-only card games to remove visual confounds, found that pupil dilation correlates strongly with those very same risk prediction errors we talked about, the mathematical surprise about volatility.
Get out. So the physical widening of your pupils is literally signaling that your brain just registered a mathematical surprise about risk levels.
It appears so. It directly links the brain's fundamental arousal and attentional system to the tracking of complex, abstract financial risk.
And does this LC arousal system connect back to the heart? You mentioned the traders and their heartbeats earlier.
Yes, it closes the loop beautifully. The locus coeruleus sends projections down that modulate cardiovascular function, including heartbeat. So those changes in heartbeat that were predictive of success in the traders. They are likely, at least in part, an indirect downstream measure of this noradrenergic LC activity signaling changes in risk, which is then integrated and felt via the anterior insula.
Wow, so it's all connected. The risk surprise triggers the LC, which boosts attention and also influences the heart. And the anterior insula reads that heart signal as part of the overall feeling of risk or uncertainty.
That's the working model. It's the body and brain working together saying, warning, volatile environment detected, maximum attention required.
Okay, this picture of emotion as useful data is compelling. But the idea that it's not just helpful, but actually necessary for rational choice, that feels like a stronger claim. Is there evidence for that?
There is, and perhaps the most classic demonstration comes from a famous neurological experiment called the Iowa Gambling Task, or IGT.
I think I've heard of this one. It involved patients with specific brain damage, right?
Exactly. Neurologists like Antonio Damasio studied patients who had damage to a specific part of the prefrontal cortex called the orbitofrontal cortex, or OFC. It's an area right near the anterior insula, heavily involved in integrating emotion with decision-making.
And what was the task?
It was pretty simple on the surface. Participants were presented with 4 decks of cards. They had to choose cards, one at a time, from any deck. Each card gave them a reward, but some also carried penalties. Unbeknownst to them at the start, 2 of the decks were good decks. They offered smaller rewards, but even smaller, infrequent penalties, leading to a net gain over time. The other 2 decks were bad decks. They offered big, tempting rewards up front, but they also carried huge, catastrophic penalties that showed up unpredictably, leading to a significant net loss over time.
So the rational strategy is to figure out which decks are good and stick with those.
Right. And healthy participants typically figure this out. They might sample all the decks initially, but they gradually learn to favor the good, low-risk decks.
And they often get a feel for it before they can consciously explain the exact rules, right?
That's a key finding. Healthy people start avoiding the bad decks, sometimes hundreds of choices before they can explicitly tell you, oh, deck A is safer because the penalties in deck C are too high. And crucially, this avoidance seems driven by a physiological signal. As healthy participants reach towards one of the risky bad decks, researchers could measure an increase in their skin conductance response, basically, tiny amounts of sweat, indicating autonomic nervous system arousal.
So they felt a kind of anticipatory anxiety. Their body was warning them before they picked a card.
Precisely. The body knew the deck was dangerous before the conscious mind had fully worked it out.
Okay, now compare that to the patients with the OFC damage. How did they perform?
Their performance was disastrous. These OSC patients consistently made terrible financial decisions in the game. They kept going back to the high-risk, bad decks, even after suffering repeated, massive losses.
Even though those decks were clearly ruinous in the long run.
Yes. And here's the critical part. When questioned, these patients often understood the rules. They could verbally articulate that decks C and D were risky and generally led to losing money. Their cognitive understanding seemed intact.
Wait a minute. If they knew the decks were bad, why didn't they just use logic to avoid them? Isn't that what rationality is supposed to let us do? Override impulse.
That's the profound and tragic insight from the IGT studies. These patients seemed rational in their verbal explanations, but their decision-making system was fundamentally broken because the emotional component was missing or disconnected. The key observation was that these OFC patients exhibited no anticipatory skin conductance response when reaching for the bad decks.
No sweat, no physical sign of anxiety.
None. No spike in heart rate, no sweat response. Their cognitive system could identify the risk, but the physiological, emotional warning signal, that fast preconscious alarm bell, was silent.
So the knowledge wasn't enough. They needed the feeling of danger to guide their actions.
That's the conclusion. Sound, advantageous, truly rational decision-making, especially over the long term, isn't purely cognitive. It seems to be critically dependent on prior, accurate emotional processing. That anticipatory anxiety, that gut feeling, isn't noise. It's necessary input. It tags certain options as dangerous, allowing the cognitive system to effectively steer away from disaster. If you remove the feeling of dread associated with risk, you seem to remove the brakes on self-destructive choices.
Okay, that's a powerful case for emotion being essential, biologically.
Yeah.
But we started by saying culture also plays a huge role. Once we have that feeling generated by the heart and interpreted by the anterior insula, we don't just act on it in a vacuum. We express it, we interpret it in others, and that process must be heavily influenced by our social world.
Absolutely. We need to shift gears now from the universal neurobiology to the much more variable, context-dependent psychology of how humans actually read and regulate emotions in social interaction. And this immediately brings up a really tricky problem for researchers trying to compare emotions across cultures.
What's the problem?
Well, think about it. If you show someone an image of, say, an angry face and ask them to rate how intense the anger is, what are they actually rating?
Good question. Are they rating how much the face looks angry, the muscle contractions, the scowl?
Right, the external visible display. Or are they trying to infer how angry the person actually feels inside, the subjective experience?
Because those two things might not be the same at all, right? We're constantly managing how we look on the outside.
Exactly. Our external display is rarely just a raw, unfiltered readout of our internal state. We learn social rules, display rules about when, where, and how intensely to show our feelings. So to try and untangle this, researchers did some clever studies, particularly comparing American and Japanese participants. They showed them the same set of standardized photos of universal emotional expressions: happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, surprise.
Okay. Standard procedure so far.
But here was the crucial difference. They specifically asked observers to provide two separate intensity ratings for each face. One rating for the intensity of the external display and another rating for the intensity of the inferred internal subjective experience.
Trying to tease apart the outside look from the presumed inside feeling. What did they find? Were there different patterns between the Americans and the Japanese?
Very distinct patterns emerged. Let's take the American observers first. Their ratings showed a clear separation. They consistently rated the intensity of the external display as being higher than the intensity of the inferred subjective experience.
So they saw the facial expression as quite strong, but they assumed the person's internal feeling was maybe a bit less intense than their face suggested, like the person was exaggerating the expression slightly.
That seems to be the pattern. They perceived the face as loud, but inferred the internal feeling was somewhat more muted in comparison.
Okay. And the Japanese observers?
Their pattern was fundamentally different. First, overall, they tended to infer a greater intensity of subjective experience than the Americans did for the same faces. But the most striking part was that there was no significant difference between their ratings of the external display and their ratings of the subjective experience.
Wait, so they saw the external expression and the internal feeling as being roughly equal in intensity, and both were rated quite highly.
Exactly. They perceived the look on the face and the feeling inside the person to be much more closely matched and generally quite intense.
Wow, that's a big difference. What does it mean? It sounds like both groups are operating under culturally learned rules, but applying them differently. Like one set of rules for showing emotion and another set for reading it in others.
That's precisely the interpretation. These patterns are thought to be driven by two related sets of cultural norms, learned very early in life. Display rules, which govern how you're supposed to express your own emotions, and decoding rules, which guide how you interpret the emotions you see in others.
Okay, so let's break down why the patterns might be different. Why would Americans rate the display higher than the feeling?
The researchers suggest this might reflect American display rules. Generally speaking, North American culture, being more individualistic, tends to value self-expression, assertiveness, and clear communication of one's internal state. There can be a cultural expectation to, perhaps, slightly amplify emotional displays to make one's feelings understood.
Okay.
So an American observer, knowing that their own culture often encourages or tolerates somewhat amplified expressions, might subconsciously adjust their interpretation. They see a strong display, rate it as strong, but then slightly downgrade their inference about the internal feeling, assuming there's a bit of cultural performance involved.
They're correcting for the expected amplification.
Plausibly, yes.
And the Japanese pattern. Rating the display and the feeling as similarly high and generally higher internal feeling than Americans inferred. How does that fit with cultural rules?
This points towards a kind of compensatory decoding mechanism linked to Japanese display rules. Japanese culture is often described as more collectivistic, placing a very high value on group harmony, interdependence, and maintaining smooth social relationships.
Right, avoiding conflict is important.
Vitally important. And therefore, Japanese display rules often encourage individuals to de-amplify or mask their emotional expressions, especially strong negative ones, particularly in public or with people outside their immediate circle, to avoid disrupting that social harmony.
So showing less emotion than you might actually feel.
Exactly. So when a Japanese observer sees an emotional face, even one that might seem relatively neutral or subdued to an outsider, they might be applying their cultural knowledge. They know that the person expressing the emotion is likely operating under display rules that encourage restraint.
So they assume the real feeling inside must be stronger than what's being shown.
Precisely. To compensate for the expected cultural dampening of the expression, they might automatically turn up the volume on their inference about the underlying subjective experience. They decode the signal by factoring in the cultural context of restraint. They assume if they're showing this much, they must be feeling it quite strongly inside.
This cultural coding seems really nuanced. It's not just about turning the volume up or down overall. Does it affect which emotions are considered okay to show or feel? You hear about differences in how anger is treated, for instance.
Absolutely. The distinction between so-called powerful emotions and powerless emotions becomes really important here, especially when comparing individualistic and collectivistic cultures.
Powerful versus powerless.
Okay.
What falls into each category?
Think of powerful emotions as those that assert dominance or push back against others, typically anger, contempt, disgust. Powerless emotions are more about withdrawal or seeking connection, like sadness, fear, shame, maybe guilt.
Okay, how are they treated differently?
In more individualistic cultures, like the US or Canada, expressing powerful emotions, especially anger, sometimes contempt is often more tolerated, maybe even encouraged in certain contexts. It's seen as facilitating self-assertion, defending your rights, clarifying your position. It aligns with the value placed on individual autonomy.
Standing up for yourself.
Right. Paradoxically, in these cultures, the norms might sometimes be more restrictive around positive emotions. Think about the social pressure to always appear happy, enthusiastic, successful, even if you don't feel it.
That's true. The pressure to perform positivity.
Whereas in more collectivistic societies like Japan, those powerful emotions, anger, contempt, disgust, are generally sanctioned much more heavily. Why? Because they directly threaten group harmony, which is the paramount value. Expressing anger openly disrupts the social fabric.
They're seen as socially corrosive.
Very much so. These emotions need to be controlled, masked, managed. Conversely, the powerless emotions, sadness, fear, shame, might be considered less disruptive. They often lead to behaviors like withdrawal or seeking support, which don't directly challenge the group structure in the same way. So they might be relatively more acceptable to express or at least elicit more sympathy.
It really sounds like a highly flexible, adaptive system, not just a rigid set of rules. It depends on the culture, the specific emotion. Does it also depend on who you're interacting with? Like, would you show more emotion to family than to a stranger?
That's the final piece of the puzzle, and it really highlights the contextual nature of these rules. Research confirms this strongly. For example, Japanese participants in one study showed significantly greater variation in their display rules for those powerful emotions. Anger, contempt, depending on who the target person was.
Oh, so?
They reported being much less likely to express these emotions towards distal targets, people outside their close circle, like professors, strangers, maybe supervisors at work. People considered part of the outgroup.
Makes sense. You want to maintain face, avoid conflict there.
Exactly. But they reported being significantly more willing to express those same powerful emotions towards close targets, people in their in-group, like family members or best friends.
So you can let your guard down a bit more with people you trust.
It seems so. It demonstrates this highly adaptive calibration. If the goal is preserving overall social harmony, you apply the strictest suppression rules when dealing with the broader social world where relationships might be more formal or fragile. But within the safety and trust of your in-group, where the bonds are stronger and can likely absorb some emotional turbulence, there's more latitude for authentic expression.
Okay, this has been a fascinating journey. We've gone from the heartbeat of a trader deep into the Anterior Insula, through the logic traps of the Iowa gambling task, and now into these intricate cultural rules about showing and reading feelings. If we try to pull it all together, what's the big takeaway? It feels like we have to seriously rethink what rationality even means.
I think that's exactly right. The single most important insight emerging from all this work, especially from neuroeconomics, is that the age-old philosophical battle pitting emotion against reason is just Well, it's fundamentally misframed. It's the wrong way to think about it. Emotions aren't the enemy of reason. They're not this messy, irrational force that we need to conquer to think clearly.
They're more like a component of reason.
An integral component. If these physiological markers, the activity in the anterior insula tracking risk, the anticipatory anxiety that stops you from picking the bad deck, the heightened interoception that helps a trader succeed, if all these things demonstrably contribute to making better decisions, of avoiding bad outcomes, maximizing long-term utility, then they must be considered part of the system we call rational.
It's like the definition of rationality needs to expand to include this rapid body-based evaluation.
Precisely. And we see direct evidence for this functionally. Remember the market bubble experiment?
Yeah, where AI activation predicted who got out in time.
Exactly. Higher anterior insula activation during that speculative run-up predicted which participants successfully cashed out before the crash. Their emotional brain region was driving strategically successful behavior in a complex, high-stakes environment. It wasn't just feeling, it was effective action.
Which brings me right back to that job offer dilemma I started with. Offer A looked perfect on the spreadsheet, the rational choice. Offer B felt calm, less certain, but calm. Maybe choosing offer B wasn't irrational weakness. Maybe that calm feeling was my anterior insula running a much more complex simulation than my spreadsheet could handle.
That's a very plausible interpretation based on this research.
Factoring in things like potential stress, cultural fit, long-term well-being, things that don't easily fit into data columns?
Absolutely. Your cognitive brain built the spreadsheet, but your emotional brain, integrating all sorts of subtle cues and past experiences, might have provided a faster, more holistic evaluation of the likely long-term utility. The rational agent isn't the one who feels nothing. Perhaps the most effective agent is the one whose bodily systems are best tuned to generate useful, high-speed emotional data to guide judgment.
But we should also acknowledge emotion isn't just about this fast bodily calculation, is it? There's a whole philosophical tradition that sees emotions differently.
That's true. It's important to integrate that perspective, too. Beyond the neurobiology, many philosophical and psychological theories view emotions not just as raw feelings, but as sophisticated judgments or evaluations.
Judgments about what?
About significance, about value. Emotions arise, in this view, because we interpret events in relation to things we deeply care about, our goals, our values, our concerns, our well-being. If something happens that threatens a core value, we feel negative emotions like fear or anger. If something happens that promotes a core value, we feel positive emotions like joy or pride.
So the feeling is a direct reflection of how an event impacts what matters to us.
Exactly. It links emotion directly to cognition, to meaning-making, to our moral framework. The emotion essentially tags an event or a situation as being highly relevant and important to the self.
And then finally, that judgment needs to lead to action, right? Emotion is also what motivates us.
That's the third crucial aspect. Emotions serve as powerful motivational forces. They provide the engine that drives behavior. They link our deep-seated, biologically grounded survival responses, like the fear system honed for avoiding predators, with socially learned, refined, goal-directed actions.
So the fear that flags the risky deck in the IGT isn't just data. It's the motivational push that makes you actually pull your hand back.
Correct. Or the feeling of dread about one job offer provides the impetus to seriously consider the alternative that promises psychological safety or better long-term fit. So yeah, emotion is this incredibly complex phenomenon. It's part subjective feeling state, grounded in physiology. It's part evaluative judgment reflecting our values and concerns. And it's part motivational drive, pushing us towards adaptive action, all working together. So we started this deep dive asking that fundamental question: are emotions just noise, or are they data? And I think the evidence we've looked at from the trading floor, from the brain scanner, from cross-cultural comparisons, it points overwhelmingly towards data. That pit in your stomach you described wasn't some irrational fog. It was, likely, a rapid, incredibly data-rich assessment generated by the sophisticated system, the heart-brain axis, with the anterior insula playing a key role. A system constantly tracking volatility, significance, potential futures, honed by evolution and then shaped and interpreted through the lens of culture.
It really reframes everything. What stands out most powerfully to me is this idea that living wisely, making truly informed choices, it requires us to stop seeing emotions as the enemy of reason. We need to recognize them for what they seem to be.
Which is?
Perhaps the body's most intelligent, high-speed system for evaluating the world. Not the antagonist to reason, but its essential partner in our ongoing search for meaning and for the best course of action.